Hey everyone, again, Stephanie with the patient story, back with Robyn. And Robyn, first of all, thank you for spending so much time with us and sharing your story. But a quick recap, you just talked about, the first relapse you experienced. This was in 2015 and going through RICE, intrathecal chemo, autologous stem cell transplant, beam chemo, and that's not it. You also went through head and neck radiation. And so that was a lot to get through. Thank you for sharing that. I think a topic though, that a lot of people are really interested in more and more now. It was hot back then, it still is, and it's growing in so many other areas, is of course CAR T cell therapy. And so before we get there, you experienced yet another situation where you realized, I'm not done with treatment. What happened? And it was about 9 months after you finished your stem cell transplant, right?
Yes, unfortunately, I went on a vacation with my youngest child as he was graduating from high school. And while we were on that vacation, I felt another enlarged lymph node. It was actually under here. And I knew I'd relapsed. And then I immediately went to my oncologist up at the center where I had the bone marrow transplant. And my husband was with me. I had a PET CT. I stepped off the table. I looked at the PET CT and I knew I'd relapsed because not only was this hot, I actually had something in my armpit. And now I had something in my right groin, a big lymph node. So I had relapsed. Lymphoma was back 9 months after therapy. And I really didn't have that many choices. I would say 3 times is not a charm for lymphoma. And I think the interesting thing is my oncologist looked at me and goes, hey, you'll have an allogeneic transplant. You're Caucasian. It's not going to be a problem. You're going to have a match. Well, as it turns out, I'm actually multi-ethnic, given my heritage. And you know how you just don't know by looking at somebody. And of course, I had no matches, no one even close, and I have no siblings. But I didn't want to have an allogeneic transplant anyway. And I had been doing some research online, and I initially wanted to have some killer T cells or something instead of stem cell, but there was nothing available. But now there was something called CAR T cell therapy. And I had seen that online, and I went on www.clinicaltrials.gov, and we started researching trials for CAR T. I found one phase 1 trial with something called the Juliet trial, phase 1, where they had 25 patients and 12 had survived and got into remission. And that was probably the best odds that I would ever have. I wouldn't have those kind of odds with an allogeneic transplant. And so we started looking for phase 2 trials for the Juliet trial, but also for, at that point, the Kite trial, and for Juno, there were 2 other products. And we started searching for those trials. Meanwhile, my bone marrow transplant guy wanted me to have a bone marrow transplant. And I'm like, I don't want to do that.
Actually, before you continue, I like that you brought that up, because depending on which specialist you go to, there's going to be sort of that response, right? Someone specializes in a bone marrow transplant. They might tell you, well, yeah, this is the way to go because X, Y, Z.
Right.
And so I'm so glad you pointed that out. Anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. CAR T is so new. This transplant physician, who's actually very famous, he said, look, you're young, you're healthy, you survived, you'll do fine. And I said, this was the worst experience. I don't know if I'm going to survive. I don't want to do this again. And I had another friend who was very experienced say, you shouldn't do this. But I actually have a younger friend who's an oncologist. He's about 15 years younger than I am. Said, hey, this is pretty good stuff. I think you'll do well with this. And so the only thing is I had to do all the research myself. And this is where I want to really stress with you guys. I had no advantage here. I had no connections. All we did was get online. And so my husband and I went on this clinicaltrials.gov site. We emailed every single center that was doing CAR T. We called them and we started looking. We're trying to find a space. I had a little blurb. I put my history in about 3 paragraphs because I knew I qualified for everything, because I had no comorbidities and I just had lymphoma. I had nothing else wrong with me. So that's perfect for a clinical trial. They don't want to have any of the mitigating factors. They want to see just how the trial works, which is what they want for these trials. That's why people with heart disease and stuff are excluded from trials, because they don't want to muddy up all of the info when you have so many other conditions. And to make a long story short, a space opened up literally in we found out about the space on a Wednesday. I flew to the center, which was actually in Ohio. I live in North Carolina. On Monday, we signed paperwork that was probably this thick to agree to do all the trial. And we signed up. I was accepted. And within the next week, I came over and they did something called apheresis, where they actually they filtered out my T cells, just like you'd filter out stem cells. They put a catheter in one arm, they put it through this machine, they filter out T cells, just like you would, like a colander, filter those T cells out, they return the cells back to your body, and then they sent these T cells out to be modified. And that was great. But the problem is I was in a clinical trial. And so there was a delay for those cells. And then my lymphoma started growing. And so they did something called a bridge chemotherapy, where they gave me something, but that was also off label. So I had an off label treatment for lymphoma called ibrutinib, which had shown effectiveness in diffuse large B cell ABC subtype, off label. Turned out that worked beautifully. It put me in remission. And these are chemo pills you take. It was so much easier than anything I'd done. And then we waited for my cells to be ready. And then there was a little glitch because I made too many cells, and the FDA didn't like that I had too many cells, so they wouldn't filter them off. I had to get FDA approved just to have my own cells back. So I had my cells out in May, and then I was scheduled to have them infused in September 2016.
I mean, wow.
Pretty crazy.
That is quite a story, and experience. Thank you so much for walking us through that. I want to rewind just a little bit too, because the issue I think there are a couple different things that people are interested in learning more about. One is CAR T. So we'll talk more about that. But the other is just the clinical trials experience. I think searching. So I know a lot of different companies are trying to, make a better version of clinicaltrials.gov to make it easier to search, but that is so far the most comprehensive, I think, database of clinical trials that are available. What guidance do you have for patients and caregivers who are trying to look for something that will be right for them, and how to navigate that website?
Well, I still think the website's pretty straightforward, because you put your diagnosis in and you just have to look at trial after trial. If you have a blood cancer, Leukemia and Lymphoma Society is very helpful. They have nurse navigators. Lymphoma Research Foundation has nurse navigators. Multiple myeloma, there's something called Spark Cures, I believe, for myeloma. And then all these other ones, right now they have CAR T cell trials for solid tumors, for immunologic deficiencies, and some of those organizations have their own nurse navigators or people who can help with advice. I just think you have to be your own advocate and start calling everywhere.
After finding something, that was great that you did, then there's the whole issue of, there's paperwork. Did you actually read every single page? What's that process like? Do you have guidance for people on that? Because there are some questions people like, okay, most of the time, we're going to be under such, great care, but there's also all these, caveats or things that we have to do because it's part of a research.
It's research. I did not read every single paper. We went over some of the guidelines. We went over the requirements, which were, to me, and this is actually standard for T cell, I had to be within 30 minutes of the institution. I had to go back for follow-ups. And this was, a series of things I had to do, and I agreed with that. I knew the results of the phase 1 clinical trial, and this was the phase 2 trial. The investigator shared phase 1. We went over side effects, and a lot of that was just one-on-one. And actually with this investigator, who is a very young investigator, she's very pro-CAR T. And I remember her looking at me and saying, "You are the perfect candidate for this. You're healthy, your bone marrow is good. You just happen to have lymphoma."
Before we go there, you brought up the fact that we've heard this before. There's a requirement that you have to be within a certain amount of time, driving distance, or even a mile radius or something of the center. And that's in case something happens, but that does mean incurred costs sometimes for people.
Yes.
So did you ask ahead of time, is the sponsor of the trial going to cover these costs? I think some people are curious about the actual logistics of these things.
I think each trial is different. And I run, there's a CAR T site on Facebook that I'm an administrator of, and I find this out. And My trial covered the actual drugs and any medical treatment related to my therapy, but did not cover the cost to get into the trial, which meant actually another bone marrow biopsy, some other CT scans, and did not cover the lodging or any kind of lost work or the caregiver. My husband at that point was not working, so he was able to go up with me. And so we got a VRBO flat and we stayed there. And it was very economical that way. But people bring that up, and some of the trials will pay for that, some of them won't. Insurance companies will usually pay for lodging for a family member and the patient around a bone marrow transplant, but not for a clinical trial, in my experience. So a lot of this is based on some type of your own financing. With us, we had to finance the car, the VRBO, the caregiver, my food, and then my insurance company covered some of the initial testing, which would have had to be done anyway if I was going to have an allogeneic transplant.
I think that lays it out really nicely. So thank you for that, Robyn. And now, yes, you did talk a little bit about the actual process with the apheresis, but please describe anything more about that CAR T.
CAR T is really amazing. The patient's T cells are removed from the patient with apheresis. They're filtered out. And just think of these little T cells as little Pac-Men. And so in these little cells, you actually take a viral vector, and it's like a deactivated virus, and you insert a protein onto the top of that cell. So that little Pac-Man binds to whatever that protein is on another cell and gobbles it up or blows it up, whichever way you want to look at it. So when you have lymphoma, the protein is something called CD19. But then there's other lymphomas that have a CD30. There are some leukemias and lymphomas that have a CD20 or 22. And now there are trials for solid tumors. And I like to use breast cancer, HER2 positive breast cancer. HER2 is a certain protein that these type of breast cancer cells carry. And so they can make a CAR T to fight HER2 positive breast cancer. And the cool thing about CAR T cell therapy is it's your own immune system. It's not, right now we use our standard chemo treatment for cancer is actually really barbaric. You either poison it, you cut it, or you burn it. That's the way we treat cancer. This way, you actually modify someone's own immune system to fight the cancer, which is really brilliant. And the T cells can cross the blood-brain barrier. So what's so important is that there's certain tumors that have brain metastasis, like lymphoma. Like a lot of people get lymphoma and it spreads to the brain. This can actually cross that and treat it in the brain. It can treat metastatic breast cancer of the brain. They're using it for all sorts of other things. But once these T cells are altered, they're cultured in a lab, and then they're infused in the patient. And then the T cells go around and bind to the tumor and blow all these little tumor balls up. But that actually can cause a response by your immune system called cytokine release syndrome. And actually, it's sort of similar to some of people's reaction to COVID. We've actually seen people with COVID pneumonia that get these horrible infiltrates in their lungs, and it's more of a reaction to the virus and the cytokine reaction as opposed to the infection. So it's very similar. Matter of fact, they were trying some of the same treatments for COVID that they use in cytokine release syndrome for CAR T. And with CAR T with cytokine release syndrome, some people get it, some people don't. Most people, it's very mild and it's transitory. It's not permanent. It just is, sort of an immediate reaction, and then it goes away.
And you experienced it a little bit yourself, right?
Yes. So my T cells were infused in September of 2016. And initially there were 20 people in the room. The infusion lasted 10 minutes. The cells were in this big. I had 600 million cells in this big a bag. And everyone clapped when they were infused. And then they sort of waited, like, what's going to happen? But within 24 hours, I started getting a fever. Within 5 days, and I was outpatient, by the way. I wasn't inpatient for this. I had a fever, but I was told if I was going to fever, go back to the hospital. It got up to over 104. I had low blood pressure, shaking chills, felt terrible for 3 days. Because it was a trial, they didn't give me anything for it. I only got Tylenol. I didn't get any of the Tosi or some of the stuff they give you things for this now that I didn't get. But it went away. And then by the time I was discharged from the hospital, my lymph nodes had gone. They'd melted like my ice cubes. They were completely gone. Clinically, I was in remission in 1 week after clinically, not with a PET scan, within 1 week of getting CAR T. Just amazing. And I felt fine. I was just tired, a little nauseous. The fatigue was there, but nothing like bone marrow transplant. It was nothing. I mean, I even joined the gym 2 weeks into it. It was great. And then I went back to work 4 weeks after CAR T cell therapy. Now part-time, only went part-time at first. And then I gradually went up to full-time because I still felt really tired. And here I am, almost 6 years out. It's amazing.
And look at you now and how quickly it worked. By the way, I'd love for you to, describe that. Had there not been the CAR T, you had been told there were very few options.
Basically, I would have 6 months to live. Without therapy, relapse, diffuse large B-cell, on average, you have 6 months to live. Now, if I'd taken some steroids or whatever, or had an allogeneic, I might have had another chance to live. But the problem with allogeneic transplant, again, I had no match, which means I'm not going to do well. Now, some people do okay, but without a match, people don't do as well. So everyone should, get on the bone marrow registry. That's my big plug, because there's a lot of us out there that are multi-ethnic. So we need a lot of people on the registry. And, I just didn't really have a chance. And then when you compare it to how sick I was after stem cell transplant, I just couldn't eat for so long. I felt terrible. I felt fine after CAR T. And now one thing after CAR T is I'm immunodeficient after the CAR T because the T cells destroy all my B cells, the cancer B cells and my normal B cells. So I've had to be very careful about infections, but just weird infections like MRSA, or CRE, all of these antibiotic resistant organisms are the ones I stay away from, which I had to change my practice some in medicine because I was doing a lot of hospital care and now I'm all doing outpatient. So just to be careful.
Right.
Didn't want to risk anything.
Appreciate you so much for highlighting the registry as well. There's Be the Match. Have done stories about that organization before because there is a great need for more representation because look at what happens if we don't have matches, right?
Right. And some people, they fail CAR T. CAR T works in lymphoma about 40% of the time, but not 100% of the time. They're working on improving it. So those people who fail CAR T, a lot of them would go on to an allogeneic transplant. Hopefully not me now. But it's just really an amazing, I just have been given a second chance at life. And it's an unusual experience for everyone. And I cherish it and I enjoy every minute. And I'm very, very grateful for medical research and all the doctors and caregivers and my friends and everyone who's really helped us along with this. It's just really special.
I'm so glad you had that, Robyn. Before we wrap, I do want to ask, because you lead conversations now specifically about CAR T, and I think it's a great opportunity to spotlight a couple of the most asked questions or, FAQs, especially with your physician background. I love that there's this unique perspective that you have.
Well, it's interesting because CAR T is a new therapy. I run this site. Everyone's very nervous about these cytokine release syndrome, all these side effects, but they don't really think about the side effects with stem cell transplant, which are much worse. Stem cell transplant, allogeneic transplant has, a 10 to 20% mortality rate just from having the transplant. CAR T almost has a 0% mortality rate. A lot of people can get neurotoxicity with this where you're confused for days. Majority of people get totally better. I really don't know of any other ones that haven't gotten better. It's taken a while. So I think the questions I get mainly are about side effects, but I think when you get to the point where you're getting CAR T, you don't really have a whole lot of other choices. So right now, CAR T is being used as a second line therapy ahead of stem cell transplant, which I think is awesome. Some people are very nervous about that, but they need to really research what the stem cell transplant side effects are, as well as CAR T, because it's a new treatment. Everyone gets very nervous about that. And I get it. So
that's why stories like yours, even if it's one person's experience, are just so incredibly important, just because you show what is possible. As we do, look to wrap up the conversation, just a couple more things. One is you've been through a lot. Sorry, really quickly, actually, you had summarized it very wonderfully in terms of the treatment before CAR T. It was 6 years of treatment, 14 rounds of chemo, 16 drugs, 4 lymph node biopsies, 3 ports, 4 lumbar punctures, 3 bone marrow biopsies, complete hair loss twice, head and neck radiation. And then, and then going through stem cell transplant and everything. So it is incredible what you have been through. And a big part of that picture is not just the support that you get from other people, but the support you have to find for yourself. And that came in the form of making sure that you had that mental health support, right? I'd love for you to talk about that.
Well, anytime you have a life-threatening situation, whether it's cancer or any other diseases, you need to sort of use any ancillary help you can. I'm a big believer in integrative medicine, as well as I'm obviously standard Western medicine, integrative medicine. I think there's actually a role for psychotherapy. I think it's really important. Anybody who's gone through a life-threatening event, you talk about people in the military who've almost died. A lot of them get PTSD. I think all the cancer patients get a form of PTSD. And it's important, I think, for a lot of patients to talk to therapists. I'm all for that. I certainly did that after my bone marrow transplant. It was very traumatic for a while. But luckily, I think it was helpful. I also recommend things like talking to nutritionists. I'm against any type of major extreme diets. I think they're not necessarily helpful for you, but it's amazing when you talk to a nutritionist how you can improve the way you feel. And I'm also a big believer in exercise. A lot of that you can do on your own. Just walking and being outside is really important. And it's amazing what the health benefits of that are. So I think it's really true. Eat right and exercise. There is a lot of role for that. It's simple but true.
Simple but true. And you also had this great line, Robyn, in something that I'd read about your greatest contribution. You had worked to being this physician and helping patients and helping people. And yet your
biggest contribution to medicine is probably not as a physician, but as a patient. And that's okay. I'm good with that.
It's an important role that you played. How do you feel in being part of this group of people that helped, move along the science and the research?
It's wonderful. I'm so happy to be able to help others. I mean, this is what I've done my whole life. I wanted to become a doctor since I was 5. I've spent my life as a physician trying to help patients, and here I'm able to help them in a different kind of way. But I think it's been a lot more impactful, and I think it's going to affect the way that cancer is treated from now on. This is the future. The immunotherapies are the future of cancer therapy, and actually, as it turns out, even some therapies for autoimmune disease. So it's a whole new world out there, and I'm very optimistic.
It's wonderful to hear. And as a physician, how has being a patient for so many years now, how has that impacted you as a physician?
I get asked that a lot. Before I had cancer, I was still pretty empathetic. But on the other hand, now, obviously, I am even more empathetic. And my practice right now does involve a lot of mammography, where I see patients every day. I diagnose breast cancer every day. I see patients who've had breast cancer. I see patients who are in the middle of chemotherapy. And I can really chat with them. And in some cases, I give them advice about going to the tertiary care centers, integrative cancer therapy center. They may not have heard of that. They may have just been moved here. I'm always happy to offer that because it is a service our group, the hospital offers. I also just hold their hand and talk to them about losing their hair twice, or losing their hair and having it grow back in, and how weird that is. And can joke about some things. And it's sort of nice. We have a special bond, some of the cancer patients and myself. And I think it's great for them. And it certainly helps me. I think it's a win-win situation.
Well, thank you, Robyn, again, for spending so much time with us, for going through everything that you had been through, and to be a light for others out there.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This is such an honor. I'm very, very flattered, and I hope this will actually help other people. I really do.
I have no doubt that it will. So thank you, Robyn, again. And for everyone who wants to watch any of the 3 segments from Robyn's story, just head to thepatientstory.com, where you'll find human answers to your cancer questions.